Heavenly Stories.
In the dawn of the world, when the earth was still young and the memory of Eden lingered like a half-forgotten dream, Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, settled into a life of toil and hope. Cast out from paradise, they worked the stubborn soil under an unforgiving sun, their hands calloused but their hearts still tethered to the promise of redemption. To them were born two sons, Cain, the elder, and Abel, the younger. The boys grew up in a world raw and unformed, where every day was a struggle to carve out meaning from the wilderness. Cain was a sturdy boy, broad-shouldered and serious, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of his parents' past. From a young age, he took to the fields, learning to coax life from the reluctant earth. He plowed and sowed, his hands stained with dirt, his brow furrowed with determination. The land was harsh, but Cain was stubborn, driven by a need to prove himself, to make something lasting. He saw the crops as his legacy, each stalk of grain a testament to his labor. Yet, deep within, there was a restlessness, a quiet resentment that the world demanded so much from him, as if the curse on his parents had seeped into his bones. Abel, on the other hand, was lighter in spirit, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the rugged world around him. He tended to the flocks, guiding sheep across the open plains, his voice soft as he called them by name. Abel found joy in the rhythm of the seasons, in the birth of lambs and the warmth of wool against his skin. He was content to follow the paths the animals trod, trusting in the provision of the land and the God who had made it. His heart was open, his faith simple but unshakable, as if he carried a piece of Eden's peace within him. Their parents taught them both about the Lord, the Creator who had walked with Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall. They spoke of his justice, his mercy, and the offerings he required as a sign of devotion. Cain and Abel listened, but each heard the stories differently. To Cain, God was a distant figure, a judge whose demands weighed heavily on a man already burdened by the earth's resistance. To Abel, God was a presence, near and constant, like the wind that stirred the grass under his feet. As the brothers grew, their differences became more pronounced. Cain's field stretched wide, his crops a patchwork of green and gold under the vast sky. He worked tirelessly, his pride swelling with each harvest, though the ground often yielded less than he hoped. Abel's flocks multiplied, their bleating a constant song across the hills. The brothers rarely spoke of their work to each other, but a quiet tension simmered beneath the surface, a sense that each was measuring himself against the other. The world was still new, and the idea of offerings to God was a sacred act, a way to bridge the gap between humanity and the divine. Adam and Eve had taught their sons to give their best, to offer what was most precious as a sign of gratitude and dependence. Cain would bring the fruits of his fields, baskets of grain, ripe vegetables, the first of his harvest. Abel would select the finest lambs, healthy and unblemished, to lay before the Lord. Both brothers prepared their offerings with care, but their hearts carried different weights as they approached the altar. The day came when Cain and Abel brought their offerings to the same sacred place, a simple altar of stones piled high on a hill. The air was thick with the scent of earth and sacrifice, the sky above vast and unyielding. Cain carried a basket heavy with grain, his steps deliberate, his jaw set. Abel led a lamb, its wool gleaming in the sunlight, its eyes trusting as it followed him. They stood side by side, brothers bound by blood but separated by something unspoken, as they prepared to offer their gifts to God. The altar stood stark against the horizon, a rough heap of stones worn smooth by wind and time. Cain and Abel approached it under the weight of expectation, each carrying the fruits of their labor. The air was warm, the sun high, casting sharp shadows on the ground. Cain's basket was filled with the best of his harvest, golden wheat, plump vegetables, the firstfruits of his fields. He had toiled for months, battling drought and rocky soil, and this offering was the culmination of his sweat and struggle. He set it down with a thud, his hands lingering on the woven reeds, as if reluctant to let go. Abel, beside him, knelt gently, guiding his lamb to the altar. The animal was perfect, its fleece soft and unblemished, its eyes wide with innocence. Abel's hands moved with care, steadying the lamb as he prepared it for sacrifice. His face was calm, almost serene, as if the act of giving was as natural to him as breathing. He whispered to the lamb, words too soft for Cain to hear, and the sound grated on his brother's nerves, though he couldn't say why. The brothers worked in silence, each focused on their task. Cain arranged his grain meticulously, ensuring every stalk was visible, every vegetable placed just so. He wanted God to see his effort, to recognize the hours he'd poured into the unyielding earth. Abel, meanwhile, prepared the lamb with a quiet reverence, his movements unhurried, his heart seemingly unburdened by the need to prove anything. The contrast between them was stark, though neither spoke of it. When the offerings were ready, they stepped back, waiting. The biblical account speaks of fire from heaven consuming sacrifices, a sign of divine acceptance, and on this day, the brothers looked to the sky, expectant. Cain's heart pounded, a mix of hope and dread. He had given his best, hadn't he? The grain was ripe, the vegetables flawless. Yet, as he glanced at Abel's lamb, a flicker of doubt crept in, unbidden and unwelcome. Then it happened. A flame descended, swift and bright, enveloping Abel's offering. The lamb was consumed in an instant, the fire crackling with a fierce, holy energy. The smoke rose in a thick, fragrant column, curling toward the heavens. Abel bowed his head, his lips moving in silent gratitude. The sight was beautiful, undeniable, a clear sign that God had looked with favor on his gift. But Cain's offering remained untouched. No fire came. No smoke rose. The basket of grain sat heavy and still, exposed under the relentless sun. Cain stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The silence was deafening, the absence of divine response a weight that pressed against his chest. He felt the eyes of his brother, though Abel said nothing, and the pity in that silence stung worse than any words could have. God's voice, when it came, was not a sound but a presence, a weight in Cain's soul. "Why are you angry?" it asked, cutting through his turmoil. "Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door, it desires to have you, but you must rule over it." The words were both a warning and a plea, but to Cain, they felt like judgment, a confirmation of his failure. Cain's hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms. He didn't look at Abel, didn't speak. The anger burned hot, a fire of its own, twisting inside him. Why had God rejected him? Hadn't he worked just as hard, if not harder? The fields were unforgiving, the earth cursed because of his parents' sin, and yet he had wrestled a harvest from it. Was that not enough? The questions churned, feeding the bitterness that grew like weeds in his heart. Abel, sensing the shift in his brother, said nothing. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but the space between them felt wider than ever. He gathered the ashes of his offering and turned to leave, his steps light but his heart heavy with an unspoken sorrow. Cain remained by the altar, staring at the untouched grain, the words of God echoing in his mind. Sin was crouching, waiting. And Cain, in that moment, felt its shadow drawing near. The days that followed the offerings were heavy with an unspoken rift. Cain returned to his fields, but the work that once brought him pride now felt like a burden. Every furrow he plowed, every seed he sowed, carried the sting of rejection. The earth, already stubborn, seemed to mock him now, as if it, too, had sided with God's judgment. He worked in silence, his thoughts a storm of resentment and confusion. Why had God favored Abel's offering over his? Was his labor worth less? The questions gnawed at him, growing sharper with each passing hour. Abel, meanwhile, tended his flocks with the same quiet diligence, though he sensed the change in his brother. He noticed the way Cain's shoulders slumped, the way his eyes avoided meeting his own. Abel wanted to bridge the gap, to talk about what had happened at the altar, but he didn't know how. His faith told him to trust God's ways, but his heart ached for his brother's pain. He tried to approach Cain once, offering a tentative smile as he passed by the fields, but Cain's curt nod and turned back shut the door on any conversation. Their parents, Adam and Eve, saw the tension but didn't fully grasp its depth. They had their own burdens, their own memories of a lost paradise, and they trusted that their sons would find their way. Adam spoke to Cain about patience, about working the land with perseverance, but his words felt hollow to Cain, who heard only echoes of his own failure. Eve, watching her sons drift apart, felt a pang of guilt, as if the curse of their expulsion from Eden had somehow poisoned her children's lives. Cain's anger grew, a slow poison seeping into every thought. He began to see Abel not just as his brother but as a rival, a symbol of everything he lacked. Abel's flocks thrived, their numbers growing, while Cain's crop struggled against blight and drought. It wasn't fair. He worked harder, didn't he? He poured his soul into the earth, while Abel wandered the hills with his sheep, carefree and favored. The comparison festered, turning Cain's love for his brother into something bitter, something dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire, Cain sat alone by his fields, staring at the horizon. The words of God replayed in his mind, "Sin is crouching at your door." He felt it now, that crouching presence, whispering doubts and justifications. It told him he deserved better, that Abel's success was an injustice, that he could make things right. The thought was fleeting at first, but it took root, growing stronger with each restless night. Abel, unaware of the storm brewing in his brother's heart, continued his work with a quiet joy. He loved the open plains, the way the wind carried the scent of grass and wool. He prayed often, thanking God for his provision, for the lambs that grew strong under his care. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Cain. He resolved to speak to him, to offer some kind of peace, though he wasn't sure what words could heal the wound he sensed. The opportunity came one morning when Abel spotted Cain in the fields, hoe in hand, breaking up the hard earth. Abel approached, his steps slow, his hands empty to show he meant no harm. "Cain," he called softly, "can we talk?" Cain paused, his grip tightening on the hoe, but he didn't turn. "What's there to talk about?" he muttered, his voice low and edged with something sharp. Abel hesitated, then pressed on. "I know you're hurting. I don't understand why God chose my offering, but I want us to be right with each other." Cain's jaw clenched. The words, meant to soothe, felt like salt in a wound. Be right with each other? How could they be right when God himself had drawn a line between them? He turned to face Abel, his eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Let's go out to the field," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. Abel nodded, relieved, thinking they might finally talk. But as they walked, side by side, the shadow of sin followed, its presence heavier than ever. The field stretched wide and open, a patchwork of tilled earth and scattered stones under a sky heavy with clouds. Cain led the way, his steps deliberate, the hoe still in his hand. Abel followed, his heart hopeful but uneasy, sensing something in his brother's silence that he couldn't quite name. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, and the brothers' footsteps were the only sound breaking the quiet. They stopped near the edge of the field, where the ground sloped toward a shallow valley, out of sight of their parents' home. Cain turned to face Abel, his expression unreadable. The hoe rested against his shoulder, its blade glinting faintly in the muted light. Abel stood a few paces away, his hands at his sides, his eyes searching his brother's face for some sign of the Cain he'd known as a boy, the one who'd shared stories under the stars, who'd laughed with him over a shared meal. But that Cain seemed gone, replaced by a man whose heart was a tangle of anger and pain. "Cain," Abel began, his voice gentle but firm, "I don't want this between us. Whatever happened at the altar, it doesn't change that we're brothers. Can't we work this out?" The words were sincere, but to Cain, they sounded like pity, like Abel was standing above him, offering scraps of compassion from his place of favor. The resentment that had been simmering for days boiled over, a flood of rage that drowned out reason. "You don't get it, do you?" Cain snapped, his voice low and raw. "You with your flocks, your perfect lambs, your God who smiles on you. What about me? I've given everything to this cursed ground, and for what? Nothing. His grip on the hoe tightened, his knuckles white. Abel took a step back, not out of fear but surprise, his eyes widening at the venom in his brother's words. "Cain, it's not about me or you," Abel said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "It's about God. He sees our hearts. Maybe there's something we're missing, something we can learn together." But the words only fueled Cain's fury. To him, they were a lecture, a reminder of his failure, a confirmation that even Abel thought he was less. The crouching sin God had warned of was no longer waiting at the door, it was here, in the field, coiled tight in Cain's chest. Without thinking, without pausing to consider the weight of what he was about to do, Cain raised the hoe. The motion was swift, driven by a surge of emotion too powerful to contain. Abel saw it coming too late, his hands rising instinctively to shield himself, but the blade came down with a force born of years of frustration and envy. The sound was sickening, a dull thud followed by silence. Abel crumpled to the ground, his body still, his blood seeping into the earth he'd loved. Cain stood frozen, the hoe slipping from his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world seemed to stop, the clouds above unmoving, the wind silent. He looked at his brother's lifeless form, and for a moment, the reality of what he'd done didn't register. Then it hit him, a wave of horror and guilt that threatened to crush him. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out, then pulled back, afraid to touch the body. "Abel," he whispered, his voice breaking. But there was no answer, only the stillness of death. The field, once a place of labor and hope, was now a graveyard, stained with the blood of the first murder. Cain's mind raced, searching for a way to undo what he'd done, but there was no going back. The act was final, and its weight settled on him like a chain. Above, the sky darkened, as if the heavens themselves mourned. Cain felt a presence, not the gentle voice of God he'd heard before, but something heavier, something that demanded reckoning. He knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't face his parents or the altar or the God who had seen it all. He stumbled to his feet, his eyes darting around the empty field, as if looking for escape. But there was no escape from what he'd done, and deep down, he knew it. Cain fled the field, his heart pounding, his hands still trembling with the memory of the hoe's weight. The blood on the ground seemed to call after him, a silent accusation that followed him through the hills and valleys. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay where Abel lay, where the earth itself seemed to cry out against him. The world, once familiar, now felt hostile, every shadow a reminder of his guilt, every gust of wind a whisper of judgment. He didn't return home. He couldn't face his parents, couldn't bear the thought of their eyes searching for Abel, their questions piercing the fragile shell of his denial. Instead, he wandered, his steps aimless, his mind a chaos of fear and regret. The words of God echoed in his ears, "Sin is crouching at your door," and now he saw how he'd failed to master it. Abel's face haunted him, not angry but sorrowful, as if even in death, his brother pitied him. Then the voice came, not a whisper but a thunder, shaking the very air around him. "Where is your brother Abel?" it demanded, and Cain's knees buckled under the weight of it. He fell to the ground, his hands clutching the dirt, as if he could hide from the question. "I don't know," he stammered, the lie bitter on his tongue. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The words were defiance, a desperate attempt to push back the truth, but they crumbled even as he spoke them. The voice of God was unrelenting. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Cain's breath caught, his chest tight with panic. He saw it now, the blood soaking into the earth, a stain that could never be washed away. God continued, each word a hammer striking his soul, "Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the soil, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Cain's heart sank. The ground, the one constant in his life, the thing he'd poured his strength into, was now his enemy. He would be rootless, a man without a home, marked by his sin for all to see. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he cried, his voice raw with desperation. You've driven me from the land, and I'll be hidden from your presence. I'll be a wanderer, and anyone who finds me will kill me. The fear was real. He saw himself hunted, alone, forever running from the shadow of his crime. But God, in his justice, showed mercy. Not so, he said. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And God placed a mark on Cain, a sign not of shame but of protection, ensuring that no hand would strike him down. Yet the mark was also a reminder, a visible weight he would carry for the rest of his days. Cain bowed his head, the weight of his sentence settling on him, and turned away, heading east, toward the land of Nod, the place of wandering. Adam and Eve, when they learned of Abel's death, were shattered. Eve wept, her cries echoing through the hills, while Adam stood silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Cain had disappeared. They buried Abel in the field where he fell, the earth now a tomb for their youngest son. The pain of their own sin in Eden paled in comparison to this new grief, the loss of one son to death and another to exile. Yet life went on, as it must, and in time, Eve bore another son, Seth, a new hope in a world marked by loss. Cain, in the land of Nod, built a life, but it was a shadow of what might have been. He married, had children, and his descendants built cities, but the mark of his sin followed him, a story whispered through generations. The earth never yielded to him as it had before, and though he was spared death, he carried the weight of Abel's absence every day. The story of Cain and Abel became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of envy, the danger of unchecked anger, and the enduring hope of redemption, even in a fallen world.